That night began like any other weekend, noisy and bright, the kind of night where people lose themselves in music just to forget who they are for a few hours. I hadn't planned to go to that party. My friends had been insisting for days, saying I needed a break, that I'd been too quiet lately. Maybe they were right. I had been silent even at home, even with him, the person who once made me feel alive. We barely talked anymore. We slept beside each other, but it felt like there was an ocean between us. I told myself I wasn't lonely, but maybe I was lying. When I walked into the party, I was met with flashing lights, laughter, and the heavy pulse of music that seemed to vibrate through the floor. People were dancing, talking, drinking, faces blurring together in a haze of color and movement. I grabbed a drink just to have something to do with my hands, standing near the edge of the room like a visitor in someone else's life. That's when I saw him, that he was standing near the bar, tall and broad-shouldered, his skin a rich deep brown that caught the glow of the lights in a way that made him stand out even in the crowd. His posture was calm, confident, not arrogant, just quietly assured, as if he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. When our eyes met, it wasn't just a glance. It was a pause. A moment stretched longer than it should have. He smiled, slow and deliberate, and I looked away before realizing I didn't want to. He walked over a few minutes later, holding 2 glasses. "You look like you could use another drink," he said, his voice deep, smooth, and a little amused. I laughed, pretending I wasn't nervous, and accepted it. "I probably could," I replied. "Rough week?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "Something like that." He didn't press. He just smiled again, as if he already understood more than I'd said. That we stood there talking for a while, small talk that somehow didn't feel small. He told me he was from Ghana, had moved here a few years ago for work. I told him I was born here, but lately, I'd been feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. He laughed softly at that, saying, "Belonging is overrated. Sometimes, being lost is where you find yourself." The way he said it, it didn't sound like a line. It sounded like truth. The music shifted to something slower, softer, the kind that makes people sway more than dance. He held out his hand, a simple gesture. "Come," he said. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who danced with strangers. But something in me, the part that was tired of thinking, told me to say yes. That we moved to the dance floor, closer than I expected. The warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne, the steadiness in his movements, it all pulled me in. I didn't know this man, but somehow, I felt safe near him. His hand brushed mine once, then again, and each touch felt like a quiet question I couldn't answer. When I looked up, our eyes met again, and I forgot about everything else, the people, the noise, even the guilt waiting in the corners of my mind. After a while, we stepped outside to get some air. The night was cool, the city lights flickering in the distance. I leaned against the wall, feeling my heartbeat slowly return to normal. He stood beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he said, softly, "You have someone waiting for you at home, don't you?" The question hit me like a whisper in the dark. I nodded slowly. "Yes." He didn't react, didn't pull away or look disappointed. He just said, "Then why do you look so alone?" I didn't have an answer. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe I'd just been pretending to be fine for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. That we stayed like that for a while, talking about nothing and everything, the city, work, the strange way people drift in and out of each other's lives. The kind of conversation that feels light but carries weight underneath. When the party began to wind down, he glanced at his phone, then back at me. "It's late," he said. "You should probably head home." I nodded, though the word home didn't feel right in my mouth. Then he added, "Unless you don't want to be alone tonight." It wasn't a command. It wasn't even an invitation wrapped in expectation. It was just a statement, gentle and open. I looked at him, trying to read his face. There was no lust there, no hunger, just calm patience, as if he was giving me a choice I didn't know I had that I didn't answer right away. I said I needed to think, and he smiled as if he already knew I would. He handed me a small piece of paper with an address written on it. "Come if you want," he said simply, and then turned to leave. That I stood outside for a long time after that. The streets were almost empty, the night air cool against my skin. I could still smell his cologne faintly on my sleeve. My phone buzzed, a message from my partner asking if I was on my way back. I typed out yes, but I didn't hit send. I just stared at the screen until it went dark. For a moment, I thought about everything, about loyalty, about loneliness, about how easy it is to lose yourself when you stop feeling seen. Maybe I should have gone home. Maybe that would have been the right thing to do. But as I stood there, I realized that sometimes the right thing doesn't feel right at all, it feels hollow. So I pocketed my phone, looked once more at the small note in my hand, and began walking. Each step felt heavier, but also strangely lighter, like I was heading towards something inevitable. I didn't know what I would find at that address. Maybe regret. Maybe comfort. Maybe something in between. But as the city lights blurred behind me, one thought echoed quietly in my mind: maybe this night isn't about what I lose. Maybe it's about what I finally allow myself to feel. The house was farther than I expected, tucked into a quiet corner of the city where the streets grew narrower and the lights dimmer. By the time I arrived, it had started to drizzle. The air was cool, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant smoke. I stood outside the small gate for a moment, unsure if I should even knock. The paper with his address was damp in my hand, the ink smudged at the edges. I could have turned around right then. Maybe I should have. But something in me whispered that turning back wouldn't change anything, it would only delay the truth. When I finally rang the bell, the door opened almost immediately. He stood there in a plain white shirt and dark pants, barefoot, as if he had been waiting. His smile was calm, the same one he'd worn at the party, though softer now, like it belonged only to this quiet space. "You came," he said, not surprised, just gently acknowledging it. I nodded, unable to find words. Inside, the house was warm and faintly lit. There was soft jazz playing somewhere in the background, and the scent of something sweet, vanilla, maybe, hung in the air. It wasn't a large place, but it felt lived in. Books stacked on shelves, a few paintings leaning against the wall, a half-finished cup of tea on the table. It was the kind of space that felt both temporary and personal, like he never stayed long but made every moment matter. He handed me a towel for my damp hair, motioning for me to sit. "You look like you've been thinking too much," he said with a slight smile. "I have," I admitted. "That's all I seem to do lately." He poured me a glass of water, his movements slow and unhurried. Everything about him was calm, grounded. I envied it. For a while, we talked. At first, it was about simple things: where we worked, where we grew up, how the city never really sleeps. But as the conversation deepened, I found myself saying things I hadn't said out loud in years. I told him how I felt invisible in my own relationship. How the silence at home wasn't peaceful anymore, it was suffocating. How sometimes, I'd sit beside the person I loved and feel like I was talking to a stranger. That he listened without interrupting, his gaze steady and kind. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and said, "Sometimes, we keep giving to people who stopped asking for us long ago." His voice was quiet but the words sank deep. I stared at him, realizing how painfully true that was. He asked me about my partner, what they were like, what had changed. I didn't know where to start. "Nothing really changed," I said slowly. "That's the problem. Everything just stopped." I looked down at my hands. I don't even know when I became this version of myself. He stood and walked to the window, watching the rain. "Maybe this version isn't new," he said after a pause. "Maybe you've always been here, just waiting for someone to notice." Those words hung between us, heavy and electric. I felt my throat tighten. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, as if he understood something I'd been hiding even from myself. He turned back toward me, his eyes searching mine. I don't want to be another mistake in your story, he said softly. You don't owe me anything. You can leave if you want. I didn't move. I couldn't. The honesty in his voice disarmed me. He wasn't seducing me, he was offering something else, space, understanding, a moment of being seen. And that, somehow, was far more dangerous. That I walked toward the window where he stood. The rain had grown heavier, streaking down the glass in silver lines. Our reflections blurred together in the dim light. What if I don't want to leave? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. That he looked at me, and in that silence, everything became clear, the pull, the guilt, the desire, the ache of wanting to feel something again. He reached out, not to pull me closer, but to gently touch my face, his thumb brushing away a drop of water that wasn't rain. Then stay, he said quietly. The moment stretched, suspended between what we wanted and what we shouldn't. I could hear my heartbeat, could feel every second slowing down. When he leaned in, it didn't feel like a decision, it felt like surrender. The room seemed to exhale with us, the rain softening, the music fading into the background. What happened next wasn't rushed. It wasn't wild or careless. It was quiet, deliberate, two people stepping into a space neither of them had planned for. His touch was steady, his presence grounding, and for the first time in a long while, I stopped feeling invisible. Every look, every breath carried something unspoken, something I didn't need to explain. That I thought of my partner once, fleetingly, like a distant shadow. But even guilt felt muted here, wrapped in the stillness of that night. I wasn't thinking about betrayal or consequences. I was thinking about how warmth feels when you've been cold too long. Later, we sat in silence. The candles had burned lower, the room smelled faintly of rain and skin. He offered me tea, and we drank it slowly, the quiet between us feeling strangely peaceful. You don't have to explain anything, he said. Not to me. I nodded, grateful and ashamed all at once. That he told me a little about himself, how he had left home years ago to start over, how he had learned that people often come into your life not to stay, but to remind you what you're missing. Sometimes, he said, it's not love we seek, but permission, to feel again, to breathe again. I looked at him, realizing how deeply those words resonated. Maybe that was exactly what this night was, permission. Permission to feel, to be seen, to be imperfect. That we didn't talk about the morning. We didn't talk about what it meant or what it would change. There was no promise, no pretense of a future. Only a fragile understanding that this moment existed outside of everything else, outside of right and wrong, past and future. When I finally lay down, the rain had stopped. The world outside felt still, almost suspended. He lay beside me, silent, his breathing calm and even. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a blur of confusion and clarity all at once. I knew I had crossed a line I could never uncross. But I also knew that, for the first time in a long while, I felt something real. Before I drifted into sleep, I thought about how strange life is, how you can spend years building walls, only for a stranger to walk through them in a single night. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe regret. Maybe emptiness. But as I closed my eyes, one thought lingered quietly, warm and certain. Tonight, I didn't just meet someone else. I met the part of myself I thought had disappeared forever. Morning came softly, without warning. I woke to the faint light creeping through the blinds and the gentle sound of rain returning outside. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was. The sheets felt different, smoother. The air smelled of coffee and something faintly sweet. Then I turned my head and saw him, standing near the window, shirtless, holding a mug in his hand, watching the rain as if the world outside belonged to him. For a few seconds, I just watched him. The stillness in his posture, the quiet rhythm of his breathing, it was strange how peaceful everything felt. The chaos in my chest had quieted overnight, replaced by something I couldn't name. It wasn't happiness, not exactly. It was calm, the kind that comes right before you start to feel the weight of what you've done. That he noticed I was awake and smiled faintly. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep, steady. I nodded, sitting up, pulling the sheet closer around me. You made coffee? He nodded toward the kitchen. I didn't know how you take it, so I made it simple. No sugar. I stood, feeling the coolness of the floor under my feet. The house was silent except for the rain. Everything about that morning felt unreal, like I had stepped out of my own life into someone else's. I walked to the table where he had set 2 mugs. The steam rose slowly, curling in the air. I picked one up, my hands trembling just enough for him to notice. You don't have to be nervous, he said softly. I'm not expecting anything. I know, I whispered. But I wasn't nervous because of him. I was nervous because of me, because I didn't know how to go back to who I was before last night that we sat together in silence, sipping coffee, listening to the rain. It wasn't awkward. It was quiet, reflective, like both of us knew that silence was the only thing that made sense. Finally, he spoke. You're thinking about home, he said, not as a question, but as a fact that I nodded. Yeah. I didn't know how to explain the storm inside me. Guilt had started to settle in, slow and cold, like fog creeping across water. I thought of my partner, of how I'd left the house without a real goodbye, of the text message I'd never sent. I imagined their face if they ever found out. And yet, beneath the guilt, there was still that strange calm, a soft voice that said this night had been something I needed, even if it shouldn't have happened. That he looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, don't make this a punishment. Sometimes, the things we regret are the same things that wake us up. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to tell him that this wasn't about regret or redemption, it was about realization. I wanted to tell him that I hadn't come here looking for love or escape. I'd come because, for the first time in a long while, someone saw me. And once you've been seen, really seen, it's hard to go back to being invisible. After a while, he stood and began clearing the table. The simplicity of his movements grounded me, the way he rinsed the mugs, the quiet hum of the faucet, the way he moved through his space like he belonged entirely to it. When he turned around, I asked softly, do you do this often? Invite strangers in? He smiled, shaking his head. No, he said. Not often. But sometimes, people cross your path and you just know, they need a place to pause. Not to stay, just to breathe. His words settled deep inside me. Maybe that's what this was, a pause. A single night suspended between who I was and who I might become. That I dressed slowly, the silence heavy but not uncomfortable. As I buttoned my shirt, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My face looked the same, but my eyes didn't. They looked older, softer, as if I'd aged a little overnight, not from pain, but from understanding. When I turned back, he was standing by the door, hands in his pockets. Leaving already? He asked. I nodded. I should. I need to face it. He smiled, that same calm smile that had pulled me in from the beginning. You'll be fine, he said. You already know what you need to do. I stepped toward the door, then stopped. Thank you, I said quietly. For last night. For listening. He nodded once. You don't have to thank me. Just remember, don't carry this like a sin. Carry it like a lesson. I hesitated, unsure what to say next. Will I see you again? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, almost gently, some people aren't meant to stay. They're meant to remind you how to feel. And with that, I knew it was time to go. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist. The street was quiet, the world washed clean. I walked without rushing, each step heavy but necessary. The city looked different now, slower, softer, as if everything had been rearranged overnight. My thoughts were a blur of questions, memories, and the faint echo of his voice. When I finally reached home, the door was still unlocked. The same silence greeted me, the same half-empty cup on the counter, the same life I had left behind. Yet I didn't feel like the same person walking back into it. I stood there for a long time, staring at the stillness, feeling the weight of everything I couldn't undo. My partner was still asleep. I watched him for a moment from the doorway. The rise and fall of his chest, the faint lines on his forehead, the small sighs in his sleep, details I had stopped noticing long ago. I sat down quietly on the edge of the bed. My chest ached, not from guilt alone, but from clarity. I had wanted to feel something real, and I had. But now I had to face what that meant, that I didn't wake him. There was nothing to say yet. Words would only break what little stillness was left. Instead, I lay back down beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain outside. It sounded different now, less lonely, more like a reminder. Hours later, as morning turned to day, I wrote him a message I never sent. Last night, I remembered what it feels like to be alive. I don't know what that means for us yet, but I know I can't go back to being half of myself. I deleted it before I could think twice. Some truths are meant to stay unspoken. That night, when I closed my eyes, I saw the rain on his window, the calm in his voice, the quiet strength in his presence. He had said people cross your path to remind you how to feel, and maybe that was his purpose in mind, that I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. Maybe it was better that way. Some stories aren't meant to continue. They're meant to live inside you, quietly shaping who you become. As the days passed, I began to notice small things again: the warmth of sunlight through the curtains, the sound of laughter on the street, the way my partner's hand felt when it brushed mine. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. That night hadn't fixed me. It hadn't justified my choices. But it had woken me up, to the parts of myself I had buried beneath routine and silence. It reminded me that love, in all its forms, is never simple, never clean. It's messy, painful, beautiful, and real. Sometimes, we find ourselves in the wrong places, with the right people, just long enough to see who we really are. And though I would carry that night with me for the rest of my life, I knew this much: not all mistakes are meant to break us. Some are meant to bring us back to ourselves.